Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session. My name is James Flores with the product marketing team here at Okta. And today, my colleagues and I, we're here to talk to you about three main things. One, O365 B2B integrations and collaborations. Two, Microsoft guest accounts. And three, Okta Workflows. So before we get started, I got to show you this. As you know, we are a public company. And so all the things that we're talking about today may be subject to change in the near future. So we may say things like, hey, we're going to build this or we're going to build that. And that may be subject to change. So when you get a free minute, feel free to read this slide in its entirety. A few weeks ago, the way we all work drastically changed. Many of you are viewing this from your home computers, and I'm actually recording this from my home computer. And all that was brought to you, kind of overnight because of what's been going on today. And what happened was, like, a lot of our companies had to shift the way we think, shift the way we work, and a lot of that resulted in a lot of B2B collaboration. For us, it was a lot of work with this platform that we're using in order to get this thing on a digital format. And for most, you're all experiencing the same thing. What we're looking at here is pretty much the standard Okta integration with O365. Many of our customers use this integration. Many of you who are new customers or potentially looking at buying Okta as a solution to help you roll out your O365 know this diagram. Users exist in one environment, they come into Okta, and they go into O365. It's a pretty standard use case, and it's really simple. Usernames that come in, they live in Okta, then they get sent right back out to O365. There's not a whole lot of business logic going on there, and so this is pretty standard use case. But what happens when we change that use case? Now here, we've added a second O365 tenant. And note, we didn't just add a new domain and register it and add it into O365. This is a completely different O365 instance. And that means you have a second application to manage, a second set of business logic to understand and adapt to, and a new set of users to manage and their licenses associated with their accounts. So why are a lot of people doing this? Well, let's take a look. Today, B2B collaboration happens all over the place. Programs like Teams, SharePoint, and OneNote all make this possible. And a lot of companies are doing this because of mergers and acquisitions. You're at this company, you just bought this company, and now they have their own O365 instance, and now you need to take their users and add them to your tenant and vice versa. And so that essentially is doubling your license count on who's going to get access to all these different applications. The second use case is really partners and contractors, which is a lot of the reason how we were able to take this conference and convert it into a digital format so fast. Right? We worked with companies who helped us write content, who created this platform. They needed access to our resources. We needed access to their resources. And in either case, you have users created in one O365 instance and also created in a second, third, fourth, and fifth. And that creates two really big problems. One, licensing. How do you pay for all these new users? And two, how do you actually manage that? How do you build these user accounts? At what point do you build an account? And who actually gets these accounts? So let's look at the first problem. Managing this influx of users. How do you do that? Well, the good news here is that Microsoft already solved that problem, and that they solved it using guest accounts or guest users. And the way a guest user works is essentially it's a pointer. So you have a guest account here, you have your actual user account here. The guest account points over to the main account. So in this world, I have an Okta.com account. Say I had a company B.com account. Whenever I needed to log into company B's resources, I'd go to log in. The system would see that, hey, this is a guest account and it's tied to this Okta.com account. It would redirect me to my Okta account. I'd log in with those credentials and I would get access to the resource at company B. It works very, very similar to Federation. And so it's almost like the same experience, but there are some notable differences. The first being permissions. Today, a regular member user using SharePoint will get full permissions to whatever the admin gives them access to. But a guest user accessing the same SharePoint application will have a limited set of permissions For example, in SharePoint, a regular user can do anything that the admin lets them, and a guest user can do anything but host a team site. And these set of permissions are different per application. So Teams has its settings, SharePoint has its own settings, and Outlook, and on and on and on. Next is single sign-on. As I mentioned before, the single sign-on experience is nearly identical. For a member user, you can use manual login or federation. And since the guest user points over to the real account, if you're using manual or federated login, it'll be nearly the same experience. And the third area is cost. Why? Because cost is like the really big important factor here. Everyone knows that when you add a new member user to an O365 tenant, that member is associated with a subscription cost. So you add 10 users, 10 times the cost, add 100 users, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting about a guest user is for every one active user you have, you get 5 guest accounts. And so you can multiply your user count by 5 with no additional cost, which is really the huge benefit here. And that kind of covers most of the licensing cost use cases that a lot of our customers are running into. What does that leave us with? Managing guest accounts. So how do we actually manage these guest accounts? How do we create them? Is it automated? Is it manual? Well, let's take a look. Today, your regular member users can be, they're all centrally managed. That means an admin has to go into the O365 UI and create a user. Or you can use Okta's lifecycle management product to create them for you in an automated fashion. And that works great. But guest users have 2 different methods they can use to create accounts. The first is the invitation method. Using invitations, any user on the domain can invite anybody they want into the environment. And all the security guys watching this, I know what you're saying. That's crazy. And you're right. And that's why most people disable this functionality immediately. So when they disable that functionality, that takes that management of those accounts and it brings it back into the IT team. So now the IT team has to understand, how do we create these accounts? When do we create these accounts? And who has the right to request these accounts? Which creates a bunch of additional overhead. And for us IT folks in the room, what do we do when we have these routine, mundane tasks, like creating accounts or resetting passwords, et cetera? What do we do with that? Well, we all know the answer to that. We write scripts, right? We take the business logic of, we're going to do X, Y, Z. We'll go to our PowerShell reference guide, type up a script that takes this business logic and put it into a PowerShell script. And that's great. We're going to take time to write that, build it, and whoever wrote it is the person who manages it. Why? Because they wrote it and they know it better than anybody else. We take that a step further. Now we need to take that script and store it somewhere. Where are we going to place it? Are we going to put it on a server, an on-prem server? Are we going to put it in Azure somewhere? How's it going to be executed? And who's going to maintain that server? Who's going to make sure that server doesn't get PowerShell updated and break my script? And who checks for errors? Like, does my script have error logic built right into it so that I know when something fails, it fails? Or does my entire team know how to maintain and debug this script when it doesn't work right? And finally, the last leg of that is a lot of these scripts that we're producing and storing somewhere, they're all schedule-based. So we take a script, we throw it into a Windows Task Scheduler and let it run. It may run every minute, every 5 minutes, every 15 minutes, every hour, or once a day, which could be cumbersome because what happens when somebody needs access? Somebody needs a guest account today. What are you going to do? Are you going to tell them, hey, you got to wait till midnight till the script runs and then we'll get your account? No, you end up going and doing it for them right away because they need it right away. And so now we're back to square one where we're actually doing this task manually. So you took all this automation stuff that we built and we're just end up doing it manually without this all this additional overhead. And so the good news is I'm here to tell you that there's a way better way to do this. And my colleague Jay and Rollin are going to walk you through that.
Thank you, James. My name is Jay Bruton. I'm a cloud architect at Okta, and I'm going to walk you through kind of what the use cases are for guest accounts. So guest accounts are very common. It's very common for users to need guest accounts because we have a lot of customers with a lot of Office 365 tenants. So what does the guest account give you? It gives you the ability to access SharePoint sites. It gets you in the global address list in Outlook, and it gets you access to Teams, OneDrive, Yammer if you're using it. And most of the tools in Office 365 have some permissions for guests, and it does vary. What does Okta bring you? It brings you a single platform to manage all of your employees, which you may already be doing, but also your partners and contractors that need to collaborate in Office 365. It gives you a custom invitation flow. You can customize the invitation messages. You don't even have to send an invitation flow. You can just automatically create the accounts. And it gives you a seamless experience for your partners because you're managing that life cycle of those accounts in Office 365 for them. And so, as I mentioned, we have a lot of customers with more than one Office 365 tenant. I have some customers that I've worked with that have over 100 tenants, and it's very cumbersome to manage users across Office 365 tenants as guests. So in this use case, Jane maybe works for a company that has 3 different Office 365 tenants. They've gone through some mergers and acquisitions, or that's just the way the company's organized. They have subsidiaries that have tenants. But Jane needs to work with some of these other companies. So using Okta Workflows, we can create Jane's account in her primary tenant, but we can also create accounts for her in these other Office 365 tenants and provision them over there as guests. And so what does this kind of look like in a company with multiple tenants? Well, most of these companies have multiple Active Directories. These users use Active Directory as their primary sign-on. Their accounts are created in Active Directory first, and then they use an Active Directory agent to synchronize those accounts to Okta and sign into Okta, and Okta is used to provision the accounts for them in Office 365, both as users and guests. And the workflow takes care of that. So how about mergers and acquisitions? This is very common. I work with a lot of customers that go through a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So in this case, let's say Bobby Inc. has merged with Atco, and Jane is an Atco employee. Jane has a member account in the Atco Office 365 tenant, and Dusty is a Bobby Inc. Employee, and he has a member account in the Bobby Office 365 tenant, and we want to use Okta Workflows to provision those accounts as guests across the Office 365 tenant. So Jane now gets a guest account in Bobby's tenant, and Dusty gets a guest account in Atco's tenant, and that's all managed seamlessly through the workflows. So what does that look like from an architecture perspective? You have an Active Directory for Atco, and you have an Active Directory for Bobby. You don't need to put any trust in place. You don't need to use traditional tools to manage that. Both of these users make it into Okta through the Active Directory agents and are synced in, and then the workflow automatically will provision those accounts out as members or guests accordingly. This is all managed through group memberships in Okta. So if you're a member of an Office 365 users group, for instance, you would get provisioned as a user in that tenant. If you're a member of the guest group, you would get provisioned as a guest in that tenant. And those group memberships can all be automated. And how about partner collaboration? So again, Jane works for Atco, and they are partners with partner.com. They use them for contract work, or they're just a business partner, a supplier maybe. We can use Okta Workflows to bring these users into the Office 365 tenant as guests, just like we do with employees in a multi-tenant environment. So Rick would get provisioned into Okta, and the workflow would grab that account and push it over to the Office 365 tenant as a guest. So from an architecture perspective, how Rick made it into Okta, there's a lot of different ways that can happen. Typically what we see is the partner would use an IDP, some sort of SAML IDP. It doesn't need to be Okta, it can be any IDP that supports SAML. And then we would do a just-in-time provisioning in Okta. So when Rick logs in for the first time into Okta, then we would put him in the group with a group rule that provisions his guest account. His Office 365 account is managed, his member account in partner.com's tenant is managed completely separately from the guest account in Office 365. So his traditional way of logging in continues without any interruption. And now I'm going to introduce Rollin Morris, who is going to do a demo for you and show you exactly how you go through and build a workflow that would trigger off of a group membership and provision that account for you.
Great. Thank you, Jay. My name is Rollin Morris. I'm a solutions engineer with Okta, and I get to do the fun stuff. Jay and James kind of talked about the context and the architecture. I want to show you this in action, show you workflows, actually taking users from Okta and pushing them into O365 as guest users. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about workflow a little bit, just to give you a little bit of background. I'm going to build a workflow that will take an Okta user and push it into O365 as a guest user. And then finally, I'll show you some additional workflows that will do some additional use case components such as updates and deletions. So with that, let me just talk a little bit about workflow. Workflow was announced at Octane as a GA product. So what does it do? Well, it's an out-of-the-box solution. So what that means is I'll be able to go to my Okta org and start using workflows directly with that. I don't need to go into any third-party solutions, anything like that. It's out of the box. The next thing that's great is it allows me to orchestrate data, identity data, and do lifecycle management flows, building out provisioning, make conditional checks, do all those things without any coding. It's all using these cards, which I will show you. It's configuration, it's connecting the cards together, but there's no coding, so I don't need to do any PowerShell script, any JavaScript, which means it's very fast to get up to speed. As far as learning it, it's easy for me to do some work and turn it over to, say, Jay. He can look at it without having to learn any of the code or any of the subroutines that I've had to build, anything like that. It's also event-based, which means that I can have these workflows execute or trigger based on actions that are occurring within the Okta org. In this case, we're going to be using some of the group membership events, and that'll be a trigger for the workflow to execute. And again, it's all configuration versus coding, so it's very easy to use, pick up, and start going with it. So there are some additional sessions on workflow, and James will show you those at the end of this session, also to go deeper into some of the capabilities of it. So with that, let's talk about the use case. So this is what James and Jay has been talking about. Is we're talking about users that are over in Okta. There's some condition or app that they may need that's going to trigger something. They're going to get created in Office 365, and then maybe in a second O365 tenant, we want to create that exact same user as a guest user. So what I'm going to do in this demo, because I'm going to build it right here in front of you, is I'm going to focus on that second and fourth step. So I'm going to have the workflows, Okta workflows, go through and see when users are added to a particular group. In this case, it's going to be a group called O365 guests. And when that does happen, I'm going to collect all the information I need about that user and go and push it into Office 365, creating that user as a guest. So pretty simple. Let's get into the Okta workflows. Okay, so this is my Okta org, and first thing I'm going to do is come over here to this new menu item that says Workflow, and I'll open up the Workflows console. So Workflow is a graphical user environment that I'm able to build these different types of workflows in. There can be multiple workflows, and I can group them by folders. Key thing I'm going to do is over here go over and say create a new workflow. And this is really the graphical environment that I can work in now. And there's two key pieces. There's always, on the farthest left side, is a trigger or an event that's going to cause this to start. And then to the right, I'll start adding actions of things I want to happen after that trigger has occurred. And so if you remember, we were talking about the way I'm going to work this is when I add a user into a particular O365 guest Okta group, I want to start taking some action. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click Add Event. And when I do that, I see all the different types of capabilities of all the events that we can watch or monitor. We can do schedules, we can do API endpoints, we can trigger off of O365 events, Salesforce events. What I'm looking at in particular for this use case is to trigger off of the Okta add user to a group. So I'm going to click on that. There are a number of different types of events in here. I'm just going to type group up here to filter it. And what I want to see is when a user is added to the group. So I'll just click that. And there we go. So now I have this trigger. And what happens is in Okta, anytime a user is added to a group, any group, this will get triggered. And I'm going to get information about the user that, the admin that was involved in it, the user that was involved in the group membership, and information about the group itself. So all kinds of good information about that. So the next step, really what I need to do is determine which group did the user get added to. And so this is where the actions start to come into place over here on the right-hand side. And there's two types of actions. There's an application action, which means I want to use an external application or Okta itself to interact with. And so these are all the different types of activities, applications I can interact with. Or there's also functions, and functions is kind of what, if you were a coder or a developer, these are things that you would have access to, except I don't have to code anything. I would just need to pick these out. So an example is what I want to do is I want to continue running this flow if it's the particular group that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to say continue if. And so it puts this card down here, and this card allows me to fill out the conditions. And if these conditions are true, we're going to continue operating to the right. So what I need to do for this test is get the name of the group that the user was added to. So I'm going to come over here, and it says the group, and this is the display name of the group. And I'm going to drag it up to the value A here. And so now this is the left side of my comparison. The comparison is going to be equal to, and now I'll just put in here a literal static, if it is called Okta guest, then I want to continue on. And so that's all I need to do to do the condition. So the next step is, if the user was added into this particular group, I need to go get some more information about the user, because what's passed in as part of the event is really just the Okta ID of the user and their display name. What I really want is their first name and last name, so I can build out the full name, and I'm going to need their primary email. So what I have to do is go out and get that additional information from the Okta org. So in this case, I'm going to add an app action, and I'll click this, and I can see the apps that are available. I'm going to go back over here to Okta and click on it, and there's a number of actions that I can take. I'm going to say read, and I can say read user. So that fills in the card here. Now it's asking me, when it goes and reads the Okta user, what information do I need from it? And I want the user's first name, his last name, and their primary email. So that's the information I want returned back. So I'll click done. And so now this is the card as it is in its current state. Here's the information that I'm going to get back. And what it needs to execute is it needs to know which user I need to get the information about. So that's going to be the user that was added to the group. And again, this is his Okta ID right here. So it's very simple. I'm just going to drag it over here, and I'm going to say take the ID that was passed in from the event and use that as the input on this card as the ID to go and read the user. So now we're going to read that user ID, and we will have the user's first name, last name, and primary email. So the next step is I need to be able to build his full name, and I'm going to use a function for that. And what I want to do is concatenate the first name to the last name. So this is, again, pretty easy. This is the steps, the fields that I have to fill out, and I'm just going to take the user's first name that was retrieved from Okta and put it in there. For the second field, I'm going to put a space, so it'll put a space between the first name and the last name, and then I'm going to take his last name and drag it into the last spot. So the output of this card will be the concatenation, the appending of the first name, a space, and the last name. That's pretty easy too. So the last step really here is I need to create the guest account in Office 365. And to do that, I'm going to go and do another app action. And there is a app called O365 Administration, and that's the one I'm going to use. So I'll click on here, and there's a number of actions that are available. And I'm going to say create. And we can see create group, cloud user. I'm going to create the guest user here. So these are the inputs for the create guest user. For their display name, I'm going to use the name that I constructed. So that's the first plus the last name. For the email address, I'm going to use the primary email. So I'm going to go back over to this Okta read card and drag that over to here. So now I'm supplying the primary email of the user. Do I want to send an invitation email? And then I need to supply a required field here. So I'm just going to put in a value. And then the final option here is what type of user do you want to create? And the user type is of type guest. So that should be all I need to create the user. And it's flowing from left to right, the event that got triggered. We tested the group name. If it's the user was added into that group, we go and retrieve the entire additional information about the user from Okta, build out their primary display name, and then supply that over to this O365 guest. So I'm going to save this now. And then I'll enable the flow. So now the flow is enabled, which means this event is live, and anytime a user's added to a group, it's going to start triggering. So what I'll do is I'll go back to my Okta org, and we'll give it a test here. I'm going to go to a directory, pull up people. We'll go to Jim Smithson. I'll look at his groups. I'm going to add him to a group called O365 guest. I'll click add. And so now on the Okta side, he's added to the guest. It's caused that trigger to go over on the workflow side. If we come back over here, and I can look at something called flow history. And this is a good way of looking at individual instances of every time this workflow has run. So I'll click flow history. And this is the actual data. I mean, this looks just like the development environment that I was just in, except if you notice, instead of the fields, me filling them in, they're already filled in. And that's because when it executed over on the Okta side, this was the data that was passed through it. So now I'm able to actually see all the data as it flowed through my workflow. And here's all those elements that we were looking at about the admin, the user, the group. And we can see that the group that the user was added to was actually called O365, so it was equal. So we went on and continued on. We passed in the user ID of the Okta user, and we pulled back his first name, last name, and his full email. And so those were passed into the concatenation. This is the primary name that was built for the display name. And so we filled that in here. We filled in the email address, and we got a success on the create user. So this all looks good from the workflow side. The last thing we can do is just go and look at it out on the Azure Active Directory. And this is the O365 tenant that we're hooked up to. And sure enough, here's the user, Jim Smithson, that we were creating. And I can pull up the details and see that the user was created correctly. So the guest users were created as a result of us adding them to a Okta group. So that all worked good. So that was our first workflow that we built together. So you may be asking, like, well, what comes next? Can I do, what if I need to update user information about the guest? And then what if I need to delete the user? So we can absolutely accommodate those use cases also. If I come back over here to my workflows, so I have additional workflows built out here for handling updates, and it's a similar type of trigger where we're going to be monitoring the user, and if an event occurs where a user is modified and they are in that group, then we're going to go and push that update over to O365. The same thing goes for deactivate user. If a user was removed from that group, then we would do the exact same type of trigger, go and grab the information and remove that user or deactivate the user out in the O365 guest account. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to turn it back over to James now, and we'll close this out.
Cool, thanks, Rollin. As you see, that what he built, he essentially took all the business logic you needed to decide whether or not this guest user needed to be created, how are you going to format his username, and he broke it out into the flows. Using those cards like the concatenate and the continue if, he used programming language to actually build it out without having to write the actual continue if logic or the actual concatenation string in a PowerShell script. And it worked really well. I mean, he built it right now in less than, I think, 10 minutes, and then he actually ran it and it worked. And so you can take something like that, like that complex business logic, write it into a workflow, and it works just like that immediately. This is practically production ready, barring any other tests you may need to run. But something like that can be easily created. And as you saw, he also had other different flows that he had. So you can take anything that you're looking to build and put it into this flow. Let me jump slides here. And so in conclusion, one of the important things to notice about all this is, one, you don't have to maintain code. You're not maintaining any infrastructure, and these aren't schedule-based. And what that means is that Okta now becomes the center of everything. Everything becomes identity-centric in that events in Okta trigger workflows to happen. So you don't have to wait for the scheduled event to happen, every night at midnight. All you have to do is trigger that flow from Okta, and in this case, it was adding a user to the group, which could also be triggered up by a group role using attributes, which could come from Active Directory, which can be manual or some other automated method used to change those attributes. But all of it was automated and easy to go. So in the end, using Okta Workflows, you can automate any of your O365 processes. You can get rid of all those PowerShell scripts, all that on-premise hardware that you need to actually just run these scripts, get rid of that dependency on the schedule time tasks, and you now have one central location to manage everyone, employees, partners, contractors, all from Okta, all using this guest user provisioning. So what's next? Well, Workflows is going GA in about 2 weeks. And so it's ready to use. So reach out to your CSM, reach out to your account executive, and get access in a preview environment and see what you can build. I'm very confident you can take any process that you have currently today and build it into a workflow. And if you like this use case, or you have ideas for other use cases that we should be building for, let us know on the ideas portal through the Okta Help Center. There, my team as well as the product management team read all of your ideas, and it helps us understand, okay, where are you guys thinking, what do you guys need, and what should we build? So if you have any more ideas that you're looking to incorporate into the product and help us make it better, please let us know through the ideas portal. And also, if you like this session and you want to learn more about workflows and what else we're building with workflows, feel free to check out these sessions. The lifecycle management session will cover all the joiner, mover, leaver scenarios that we built today in our current LCM product. It'll talk about how that works in workflows and what we're thinking about doing in the future. Also, one second, there we go. Also, we're also going to be covering the advanced options for customer identity, how we're going to take the product and potentially change it to use in the customer identity space. So we're thinking things like identity proofing for customer registration. If that's something you're interested in using workflows Workflows for, check out the middle section here. We're also going to be talking about NTT Data, who took workflows and used it to manage their identities across 900 different companies that they all own. And third, when we think about Microsoft, this use case is really one use case for Microsoft, one integration point that we use. There's a whole ton of different integrations that we have with Microsoft, things like autopilot enrollment policies that will help you roll out Windows 10, and GCC High support for our Gov customers. So if you're looking for more information on the actual Microsoft roadmap, feel free to check out that session. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.